All right, this morning we're going to look at Daniel chapter 6. We're going to mostly just be in the book of Daniel, kind of looking at his story, but I want to start with just reading verses 1 through 5 of chapter 6. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give an account to him so that the king would suffer no loss. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. So the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault because he was faithful, nor is there any error or fault found in him. Then these men said, we shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Let's pray. Father, we pray, God, as we come to your word, Lord, that it would do its work inside of us, Father. Your word says that you don't return void, but that your word goes out and it accomplishes its work. And so we just ask you, Lord, would you find us to be faithful, God? Would you strengthen us and help us, God, as we study your word? In Jesus' name, amen. And forgive me, I've been sick this week. I'm overcoming a cold, so bear with me. You know, Daniel stands out in the history of the world as one of those people who has had an outsized influence. He really was used by God to shape and to mold the world in a pretty significant way. You know, you think about the span of human history and you think about the different times as you kind of look over history, the different people who have had that kind of influence, the different kinds of kings and leaders and wealthy people who have had an outsized influence on shaping the world. Typically, oftentimes, they're people who come from a certain pedigree. They're people who have a certain background. They come from a certain stock. They're people who maybe come from a royal family, or they're connected in some way, or their forefathers were important peoples. And so you actually see these families or these dynasties kind of appear over time that have people that, regardless of what their own particular giftings and strengths are, they're in that position because of the family they were born into, or the circumstances they're born into, or inheritance that they received, something like that. But every once in a while in history, you'll come to someone who had an outsized influence on the world, who had to dramatically change the landscape of the world, who did not come from such a background. In fact, they came from really modest means or very humble beginnings. You think about somebody like Genghis Khan. Okay, I just drove up to camp, was in Idlewild last Sunday. I listened to a 5-hour podcast, 2.5 hours up, 2.5 hours back on Genghis Khan. What's interesting about Genghis Khan is that he was from Mongolia, and it was a very tribal, culturally very tribal place, and they're famous for warring against each other, and nobody could ever kind of connect the clans. Well, Genghis Khan started as the way his parents met was very inauspicious. His mom had married a guy, and they were on their honeymoon, and Genghis Khan's dad, not his dad yet, was up on a hill, saw this woman, wanted her, and then basically drove her husband off, tried to kill him, and he fled, and then he kidnapped her, and that was how Genghis Khan's mom and dad met. Not the best beginnings, right? So then Genghis Khan's dad died when he was about 7 years old, and leaving their family, and the clan that his dad was a part of rejected them. And so basically now, Genghis Khan is just having to take care of his mom, 7 years old. They're trying to make a way with no clan at all. Well, somehow through gifting and talent, and he was able to grow up and become a great leader, unite these clans, where the Mongolian Empire under Genghis Khan was the largest contiguous empire in the history of the world. Unbelievable, from such meager, humble beginnings. Or you think about in our own history, somebody like Abraham Lincoln, who did not come from incredible great stock. In fact, he grew up in rural Kentucky in a log cabin is where he was born. He had no formal education. He had less than a year of formal education, and that less than a year was spread out in a bunch of short little parts over his entire life. And yet, he went on to become a lawyer. He actually trained himself. Back in those days, you didn't need a law degree to become a lawyer. You just needed to pass the bar exam. And so he self-trained himself. He studied law, and he learned it, and he passed the bar exam, became a lawyer, and then became one of the most influential presidents of the United States of America. From such a humble beginning. Well, Daniel was one of those kind of people. Daniel, the beginning of his life was very humble. In fact, he was very disadvantaged with how he started. When we find Daniel, we find he's 15 years old, and he's being led off from a conquered people in Judea. He lived in the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem had been destroyed by the Babylonian Empire. This giant, great empire had come and swallowed up all of Babylon, and now he was being led off as a prisoner of war after the siege of Babylon. King Nebuchadnezzar had laid siege to that city. We don't find anything about Daniel's family. We don't find anything about Daniel's people, and so it's likely that Daniel's family and friends were killed or lost in battle, and Daniel is taken off as one of the spoils of war to be taken back to Babylon to be put into a Babylonian school in order to be trained to become of service to the king. Not in his city, not with his place, and not with his people. And yet, Daniel grew to serve at the highest levels in two separate great world empires, the Babylonian Empire and then the subsequent one, the Medo-Persian Empire. He became indispensable because of the skill and the value that he added. He served 4 different kings listed in the book of Daniel: Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Darius the Mede, and Cyrus the Great. And in each of these administrations, not only did he ascend the order and to become one of the highest and most influential people, but he also became a prophetic voice for the living God and the one true God to these pagan people. How is it that Daniel was able to accomplish such extraordinary things from the position of being a slave? Well, I think there's a key there that we read in that opening chapter. It's in verse 3. It says, "Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him." Say, an excellent spirit. Daniel had an excellent spirit. You know, one of the things that we do to our own detriment today in society is that we have so elevated like identity politics and what we call intersectionality, that we so try to identify people with their grievances, with the things that they have working against them. So we say things like, here's how intersectionality works. If you're a minority in some way, okay, so if you're either a racial minority, an ethnic minority, a religious minority, you identify as some sexual minority, or if you're a female, that you are somehow disadvantaged, okay? The system is built against you. And the way intersectionality works is if you have not just one of those things, but if you have 2 of those things, then it's really disadvantaged against you. And what's even worse, or actually in this structure, better than 2 is 3. And if you're really lucky, 4, okay? So if you have 4 of these things working against you, then you are really the one who the system hates the most, and so you are the winner somehow of this victim culture. And it tells you to embrace that, and the idea that you're never gonna have a fair shot, that always the system and the people and everything is gonna be against you. Well, if you really hate a kid, that's what you want them to grow up believing. You want them to grow up believing that they never have a chance, because no matter how hard they work, no matter how much effort they put in, no matter how excellent they are, they're never gonna be able to get ahead because the system is always gonna drag them back down. Well, Daniel stands, and thousands and thousands and thousands of examples stand in opposition to that. That actually what you want your kids to believe that is that, look, if you are faithful, if you stay the course, if you work hard, if you apply yourself, if you have an excellent spirit and you serve God, you can have confidence that God is going to use you and that you're going to be successful in this life. You can have confidence that you are going to fulfill your potential. You know, I want to just belabor this point for just a minute because it's very likely that you and I are not going to be called to perform on some world stage like Daniel was, okay? Like very few people in the world actually have that calling to have that kind of influence and be raised to that position of power. But the truth is that you do have a stage that God has called you to perform on. There is a sphere in your life. There's a place that God has put you, that God does desire to use you and for you to be used for his purposes in that space. So whatever that space is, God is saying, I think, to us that if you have an excellent spirit, if you apply yourself, you'll fulfill the destiny, the potential that God has given to you. Let me try to show this real quick. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10. I want to look at 3 verses from the New Testament. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, it says, "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them." Now, I love this verse because it tells us so much about, it situates us to where we're supposed to be. It tells us so much about who we are and why we're here. It says that we are his workmanship created in Christ Jesus, that you and I were designed and made by God. We are not here randomly because some protoplasm bumped into each other until somehow the random causes of the universe cause us to be here and there's no purpose. No, it says that you were created and designed. You are his workmanship. Not only that, but you were created for good works, which God prepared for you. That each one of us has a certain specific, unique purposes and destinies in our life that God has called you to. And he's called you to accomplish those things. And not only that, he designed this, he planned this up before your parents ever even met and got together. Before anyone ever knew your name, it says he prepared them beforehand so that you should walk in them. So each of us has a calling on our life. Each of us has a destiny, a purpose for our life, things that God has created us and unique to us that God has created and designed us to walk in. Now, but the last part, it says, so that we should walk in them. And what that means is there's a very important part of this, that you don't just everyone doesn't automatically fulfill their destiny that God designed for them. That you have to make a choice that you are going to walk in those things that God has called you to. You have to cooperate with him. You have to join him. God is going to open certain doors, but you're going to have to walk through them. You're going to have to make a choice. So you're going to have to join. You put your effort, your risk. You're going to put yourself into it. You're going to have to, your own work ethic is going to make a decision. Are you going to fulfill the calling that God has in your life, or are you not? Just because God blesses you with an opportunity doesn't mean you're going to succeed. You still have to seize that opportunity. 2 Peter 1:5 says, now for this very reason also, applying all diligence, in your faith supply moral excellence. It says that it's good to have faith, it's necessary to have faith, but we should add to our faith virtue or moral excellence. Now, this is not, I want to be really clear, this is not talking about salvation. The Bible is very clear. We all believe here that salvation is by grace alone through faith alone, okay? So it's not you can't work, you can't earn it, you can't make yourself more desirable to God. God just loves you, and he will receive you as a son or daughter. He will save you simply by having faith in him and receiving his grace, okay? But after having done that, after being saved, you have to add moral excellence to your faith. It's not good enough to say, well, I'm a believer and I trust God and I believe God. If you're not a morally excellent person, if the good works do not go along with that faith, then you better start wondering if you really have faith. Because all Christians believe that saving faith produces something in us, which is good works, and that we should go after those good works. We should do those good works in our life in order to add them to our faith to become a whole person, the full Christian. And finally, I want to look at a verse in Colossians chapter 3, verses 23 and 24. Whatever you do, do your work heartily as for the Lord rather than for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. It is the Lord Christ whom you serve. It says here that Christians should have the greatest work ethic of anybody else. Our work should be done heartily. Why? Because we're supposed to do all of our work heartily as unto the Lord. Now, I don't care who the president of your company is. I don't care who your boss is. I don't know who your direct report is. Whatever it is, your main boss in this life is Jesus Christ himself. And so we should do all of our work like we're working for him. And you might be thinking, well, I work for a paycheck, so that's why I go to work. But the Bible here says you should have something greater, much more valuable than your paycheck in mind when you go to work, which is you want to receive a reward from him because he's your boss. And so you're trusting that God is going to reward you and give you an inheritance in the Lord whom you serve. Now look, whether you work on Wall Street or you work in the grocery store, whether you write code or whether you administer second grade spelling tests, whether you're a stay-at-home mom or whether you work in a restaurant, whatever it is, we should be doing our work heartily as unto the Lord. And it's not just our job, but it's also everything we do in our lives. If you volunteer here at the church, you should do it heartily as unto the Lord. If you're an usher, if you work in the coffee bar, whatever it is, you should apply excellence, and you should have an excellent spirit in order to accomplish those things that God has, those doors that God has opened, those opportunities that God has given you. That was Daniel's secret, is that Daniel brought the same excellent spirit to everything that he did. We actually find early on, we talked about Daniel, his beginnings, but right there in the beginning of Daniel chapter 1 was the first test that he was going to encounter, right? So just imagine yourself again, a 15-year-old kid, right? Remember what you looked like at 15. You're not a kid anymore, but you're not an adult either. You know, you're starting to show signs of maturity, but you're not ready to go take on the world. And Daniel finds himself here in this terrible situation where his entire culture, his entire society has been blown up. His entire future is completely uncertain. He doesn't know what's going to happen to him. He's getting led off into this foreign nation. You remember, he comes from people who is supposed to be come apart and be separate, be holy, set apart for the Lord. And this went into everything that they did. All their parts of life was designed around spiritual fidelity, religious fidelity, the things that they ate, the things they did, the way that they talked, their rituals, all this kind of stuff. And now he's being taken to a city that is famous for its grandeur and its bigness, but it's the kid from the little town going to the big city where all manners of vice and sin abound. And Daniel's going to be brought into this school for indoctrination where they're going to change his name, they're going to change his clothes, they're going to change his diet, they're going to change everything about him, because what they did is as this Babylonian empire would conquer people, they'd take these kids of promise, or these kids that showed some kind of giftedness, and they'd bring them back and they'd train them in how to be a Babylonian so they could come fit into this culture. Well, Daniel, as this is beginning to happen, he realized this is going to be a problem for him. When you are thinking about how am I going to fit into a group, right? You're the new kid at school, or you get a new job, new place of work, new whatever. There's a real strong temptation to fit in, to just kind of like adopt the values of the people around you, the kind of the vibe, what they're doing, and kind of be about those things. And there's actually, there's leadership techniques that they talk about mimicking, where, you kind of just subtly reflect their tone of tempo or their values or those kinds of things in order to curry favor and kind of fit in. And there's a lot of people who that's their plan on how to move up the corporate ladder. They're gonna go play tennis with the boss, and they're gonna try to get favor, and they're gonna try to work around him. Well, there's another way, which is sometimes where Daniel's gonna be tempted to do that, but he's gonna have a problem because his faithfulness to God is gonna come into conflict with his desire to succeed, because the fit in is he's going to have to compromise some of the things he's unwilling to. But look what it says here in Daniel chapter 1, verse 8. It says, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies." Now, remember, when we're talking about diet and we're talking about Old Testament Israelites, we're talking about people. It's not like, he's asking for the non-gluten options, okay? It's not like, it's a religious imperative that he only eats a certain way. And when he's in a foreign place, he can't eat the meat, he can't eat all this kind of stuff, because they can't do it the way that he would need it. And so he says, "Can you just give me vegetables?" And so he asked the chief eunuch, could he just give him and his friends a vegetarian diet, which would be acceptable for him to eat. In verse 10, the chief eunuch says, "I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king." His concern is not that he's going to get reported to HR or maybe get written up. His concern is that he lives in a Iron Age monarchy where his head will be gone if the king is displeased in any kind of way or feels like his orders were undermined in any kind of way. So Daniel says, okay, well, let's do something. So he says, "For me and my friends," and then we get these three friends he has, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, which we're going to find out later on. We're going to know them more popularly by their Chaldean names, which is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But these four guys are there together, and it says, I said, "Let our appearance, give us for 10 days, let us just eat vegetables and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and as the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies. As you see fit, so deal with your servants." So he consented with them in this matter, and they tested him for 10 days. So 10 days, they said, we'll eat our way. You can compare us at the end and see how it works out. At the end of the 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate at the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion of delicacies and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables. Daniel purposed in his heart, right from the very beginning at 15 years old, I'm not going to compromise. I'm not going to defile myself. I'm going to remain faithful to God. It's hard to take unpopular stances, but there are times in your life where you are going to be called to stand up for the truth. I'm not talking about being obnoxious and at every chance battering people over your head with your Christianity, or everything's a nail and so you're just going out there smashing everything. But there are times that are unavoidable when you're going to come into a conflict with people, because you're going to have to either stand up for the truth or you're going to have to be quiet. And if you be quiet in those moments when it's important for you to stand, or it's important for you to register what your beliefs are, it's important for you to speak up, you're going to have a really hard time following God. In fact, I've seen so many people over the years just compromise and fall out because they failed to stand when they needed to stand, and so they just ended up becoming just like everybody else, and they lost the light. They lost the distinctiveness of being Christians. Here it was interesting that we have that Daniel, this is the only time that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are put in the same place. They're mentioned. The rest of the rest of Daniel is going to focus mostly on Daniel, one chapter on those three friends, but they're never mentioned together again. But I like to think the subtext of the book of Daniel is that the four of them are going through these things together. When you have somebody there, it's hard to stand up by yourself, but when you have somebody else who's willing to stand up with you, that can make all the difference in the world. But some of us, we're not surrounded by those kind of people. In fact, we're surrounded by the opposite kind of people. My grandma used to say, if you lay down with the dogs, you're going to get up with the fleas, right? What she meant was you hang out with people with low character, you're going to suffer consequences because of that. There's going to be consequences because of that. And, if there's some of you in your life, there's people in your life who have influence over you who are constantly trying to pull you back down. They're not concerned about you fulfilling God's purposes in your life. In fact, they're concerned with the opposite. They don't want that. What do you think, you're better than us? You're such a hypocrite. They always have some comment or some turn of phrase or some, here, have an extra drink, or they have something that they're going to encourage you and to keep you from really focusing on and becoming the person and fulfilling the destiny that God has for you. It's like that experiment with the crabs in the bucket, right? You put one crab in a bucket and they're very ingenious, he'll find a way to get out. But they found that if you put multiple crabs in a bucket, as soon as one starts to try to climb out of the bucket, the other crabs will pull him down. And if that crab continues to try to get out, not only they'll pull him down, but they'll start to tear him apart. I don't know what's wrong with crabs. I don't know why they're just such bad animals, but they're bad. Very low character. But some of you have people in your life that are like that. As soon as you try to say, okay, I'm gonna do better. I'm gonna live in this way. I'm gonna become more excellent. I'm gonna pursue this thing. I wanna pursue something that is good and good for me and godly in our life. There's people who are gonna tear you down. They're gonna keep you from doing that. Well, I wanna tell you that's your fault. You are in charge of who you let influence you in your life. You're in charge of who you spend your time with. You're in charge of that. And so you need the opposite is also true. There are people you can find that will encourage you, that will hold you accountable, that will strengthen you, that will stand with you, that will inspire you, that will cheer you on as you make those kinds of decisions in your life, as you really go for it. Those are the kinds of people you want to surround yourself. Those are the kind of people that Daniel surrounded himself with. It's an incredible blessing to have people that are going to encourage you in your life. Well, I want to go back to Daniel's spirit of excellence. What does it mean that Daniel had an excellent spirit? Well, one of the things is that Daniel stood out because of his intelligence and his wisdom. He was an extraordinary leader who became very competent at his job. In the 5th chapter of Daniel, we have the next king that he's going to serve. Nebuchadnezzar has now died. He's serving King Belshazzar. And Belshazzar was sort of a foolish king, and Daniel had fallen out of the prominence, and he no longer was in charge of the leadership, and Belshazzar didn't even really know who Daniel was. But one night, Belshazzar is having a big party. He's throwing a big party. It's very raucous, and he calls for the utensils from that they had stolen from when they had sacked Jerusalem, that they stole from the temple, to be brought out. And now they're gonna drink and party with the utensils that were made for God's kingdom, for God's temple to be instruments of worship. And it says they're using them and they're worshiping the gods of silver and the gods of gold, and they're doing all this kind of terrible, profane things. And it says that a hand appears and writes on the wall a cryptic message that no one can understand, but they all see it. It's like unbelievable. And so they're all freaking out. And they call in all the different soothsayers and magicians and the people who might be able to solve this for them and answer, and nobody has any clue what it is or what it means. And we're not going to get into the story too much, but we're just going to look at what the queen comes in and she says, oh, there is a man in your kingdom who can help you. In Daniel chapter 5, verse 11 and 12, she says, there's a man in your kingdom in whom is a spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. This was because an extraordinary spirit, knowledge and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, and solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation. Daniel was much more than just a nice guy. He was much more than just a good guy. He was a useful guy. He was a problem solver. He was able to solve difficult problems. He was able to go into a situation with lots of extenuating circumstances and lots of complicated details. He was able to simplify it. He was able to make a clear path forward. He was able to solve problems. He had become not just a good person, but he had become proficient at his craft. He had become an expert at his job. One of the things that I tell young people is if you want to have a great career, what you need to do is find something useful that goes with your aptitudes, what your strengths and your giftings are, and just become an expert at that thing. It's important it's useful, okay? It's not like get really good at Fortnite, or Zelda. That's not, there's people out there doing that. That's not what I'm talking about. Something that somebody's going to want to pay for, because if you are a problem solver, you will never not have a job. Okay? You talk to business owners, people, titans of industry, people who hire people, they will, even if they're not hiring, if they meet a problem solver, someone who's good at solving problems, they will hire them. They will find a job for them. Because there are too many people who cause problems and not enough people who solve problems. And so if you become the kind of person who has an excellent spirit, a good work ethic, you know how to solve problems, you will always have a job, you will always make good money. Because if you become proficient in some area, if you make some area your craft, and you don't just say, okay, I'm gonna do the bare minimum and enough to get by, but you say, I'm gonna become excellent at this. I'm gonna really apply myself. I'm gonna get interested in this. I'm gonna pursue this. You're gonna become a useful person. So Daniel was bright, he was smart, but it wasn't just that. He became really good at what he did. He became a person with an excellent spirit who was able to come in and solve problems, explain enigmas. He had knowledge and insight. It wasn't simply that, though, but Daniel was more than that. It wasn't just that he was good at his job, but Daniel not only did he talk the talk, but he walked the walk. Daniel was the real deal because Daniel was also morally excellent. It wasn't just he was smart and full of wisdom, that he was talented, that he was gifted, but he was morally upright. Sometimes because success will cause you other problems, new problems, and that was the situation that Daniel found himself in. So here in Daniel chapter 6, we have a whole new empire now that he has risen to the top of. He is one of 3 governors over the entire Medo-Persian Empire that spanned from India to around the Mediterranean, okay? It was a massive empire, and Daniel was one of the only 3 governors who administrated the entire thing. And it says there that the king was so impressed with him that he was distinguishing himself, that Daniel was going to make, the king was going to make him, Darius was going to make him the single king over the single leader, administrator over his entire kingdom. But the problem that caused was that you had all these Medo-Persian guys who had the right pedigree, who went to the right college, who came from the right families, who didn't like it. Because what is this Judean doing getting above us? They were offended by that. And so they did what all politicians do. They tried to dig up dirt on Daniel. And look, this is what politicians have been doing this for thousands of years, right? They find their opposition, they get intelligence about them, they have people go through their trash, and they hire detectives, and they go through their tax returns, and they talk to their neighbors, and they just find anybody who can give them a sketchy story, and then they hold it, and they wait. And they wait. Look, I'll tell you. We're going to have an election coming up in 3 years, okay? I don't know who's running. I don't know who's going to be in the ballot. I just know that at some point, right before usually we start casting votes, some big bombshell story is going to come out about one of them. We're all going to say, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. Because this is the scam. This is what it's been going on for thousands of years. They're going to wait, and they're going to just release it right at the time where it's going to have the biggest impact, and they're going to try to discredit the person or hurt their character or whatever it is. We see it all the time. It happens all the time. And so that's what's happening here to Daniel. These guys are so offended that they're like, we're going to find something. We're going to dig up some dirt on Daniel. But here's the problem. There was no dirt to dig up. It says in verse 4, so the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault because he was faithful. Why? Because he was faithful. Faithful to who? Faithful to the king? Faithful to his career, faithful to his family, faithful to his wife? No, because he was faithful to God. And because he was faithful to God, It made him faithful to the king. It made him faithful to his employees. It made him faithful to his wife. It made him faithful to his family. Because when you have God at the top and you're saying, Lord, I want to be faithful to you, it extends to every different area of your life, every different part. And so that faithfulness to God permeated all of who Daniel was. He really was who he said he was. He didn't act different when he was at work, different when he was out with the boys, different when he was with his friends, and different when he was with his wife. He was a man of moral excellence. He had an excellent spirit was in him, and he conducted himself like that. And so he was faithful. Now, God forbid, and I hope it never happens, but what if somebody turned that kind of investigation on you? What if they looked at your tax returns and they went through your trash and they looked through your browsing history and they talked to your friends and what would they find? We want to be the kind of people who live consistently across our entire lives, who live with moral excellence. And the truth is, you are going to be weighed and sifted by the living God. He's not some half, he's not some sorry detective trying to dig up slimy details. He's the perfect judge of the universe who sees all and knows all. We should live all of our life like it's being done in the middle of the day before the Lord. That's what Daniel did. And so they said, look, if we're going to get Daniel, we're going to have to get him in some way because of his faithfulness to his God. And so they hatched a plan. They said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go to Darius. And they went to him and they said, "O king, you're so wise, you're so handsome, you're so smart, you're so brave. We think that you should write a law that for 30 days, no one in the kingdom can pray or ask supplications of any other God except for you. They should all come to you. You're like our God. You are that great." And he says, yes, you guys are all very perceptive. I agree with you on all those things. Yeah, let's do that. And they said, let's make it official. We'll put it on the books, and according to the law, the Persians and the Medes, anything you sign, it can't be undone, right? I mean, just to, let's make it official. They make it official, and then they know that their trap has been sprung, has been set. And so I love this in verse 16 of Daniel. It says, in verse 10 of Daniel, it says, of chapter 6, it says, now, when Daniel knew that the document was signed, when he knew the document was signed, he entered his house. Now, in his roof chamber had windows open toward Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. Daniel, for all of his wisdom, all of his intelligence, all of his political savvy, all of his incredible connections and abilities. What's interesting here in Daniel chapter 6 is you don't get Daniel saying anything. You don't get him trying to come up with a novel way out of it. You don't get him trying to, cite some kind of, Hammurabi's code to why this doesn't work and why the king can, nothing like that. He doesn't try to find some way out of it. He just sees to what's happening, and he just continues on his path that he's always walked in. What's interesting here is that Daniel's like 70 years old at this point in his life. So there's a far cry from the 15-year-old boy who got brought into Babylon. Here he is now in his twilight years, towards the end of his career. It's interesting that it says that his doors were open to Jerusalem. How easy would it have been for Daniel just to kind of like close the doors, right? I mean, didn't Jesus say, this copies later, but didn't Jesus say we should go into our inner closet and pray where no one can see us? He could have made up some kind of rationale. He could have just wink, wink, nod, nod, not let people know. But no, he consistently did what he had been doing all the years prior, which is 3 times a day. He consistently went before the Lord and prayed to him and worshiped him and made supplication. Because Daniel understood that whatever his skill set was, whatever his giftings were, none of that mattered. What really mattered is that he sought the Lord, and that the Lord was ultimately in charge of his life. And that God had brought him this far, and he was not going to leave God now. And so he allows himself to be caught. Now, The other thing that is going on here, we have to remember, is that we have an eerily similar story that happened to his three buddies, right? We have the story just a couple chapters earlier of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego with Nebuchadnezzar, where Nebuchadnezzar had built a gold statue, and he said, every time the music plays, everybody in my kingdom has to bow down and worship this gold statue of Nebuchadnezzar. Well, that would happen, the music would play, everybody bow down, except for these three guys were standing up like beanpoles in the middle of everybody else prostrate on the ground. And it got back to Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar didn't like it, and so he brought him before him, and he said, listen, I'm gonna give you one last chance. I'm gonna play the music, and if you don't bow down, I'm gonna burn you alive in the furnace of the city. And I love these three guys. They just said, I'll save you the musician's time, O king. We're not even gonna answer you in this. We're not bowing down. God can rescue us from you if he wants to. But if he doesn't want to, we're still not bowing. It says that Nebuchadnezzar was enraged, that he heated the furnace, I think, 3 times as high. He brings him down there and throws him, casts him into the fire. We all know the story because it makes such a great, children's book story. Like we've known it since we were little kids. So he squints into the fire and he sees them walking around in there, and he says, who's the fourth guy? Right? This is a pre-incarnate Christophany, where Jesus himself is in the fire protecting them. And you think about what a supernatural, radical experience that was for these guys. But you know who they got when they got home that day? You know who the first person they called was? It was Daniel, right? Bro, I know you're out somewhere, because he would have been with them. I don't know why he wasn't there. I don't know, they're not calling, right? They're like chiseling on some rock. Take this to Daniel, But when they got Daniel ready, he's like, bro, we were in this fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar freaked out, and dude, it was awesome, and God showed up, And so here's Nebuchadnezzar, 70. Here's Nebuchadnezzar, 70 years old. And now he's in a very eerily similar situation where King Darius, another king. Now, King Darius is clearly egomaniacal, clearly loves his own, but he has a different disposition. He doesn't want to do this at all, but his hand is forced because he actually loves Daniel, but he feels stuck. But he says this great thing. It says in verse 16, then the king gave orders that Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. The king spoke and said to Daniel, your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you. A stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing could be changed in regards to Daniel. And the king went off to his palace to spend the night fasting. The king he realizes that he's been conned, and he realizes it was to get Daniel out of the way, and now they got what they want. But he has this hope that maybe Daniel's God, whom he constantly serves, will save him, will rescue him. And it's interesting that King Darius knows who Daniel is and what he does. It says he goes that night and fasts, and he's praying, and wonder who he's praying to. It's like Daniel had been ministering to him and been evangelizing him, been telling him about the one true God. Man, whatever kinds of crazy pagan gods you worship, that's not it. There's one living God, and he's the God of the Jews. He's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's the God you should serve, and so he says maybe he'll save. So he spends all night. It says early in the morning, the king arose at dawn at the break of day. I want to invite the band up. At the break of day, and he went in haste to the lion's den. When he had come near to the den, to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? Then Daniel spoke to the king. This is the first time Daniel's words are recorded in Daniel chapter 6. So it's not until after this miraculous thing happens that he's been vindicated, that he actually opens his mouth. He says, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me. And as much as I was found innocent before him, and also toward you, O king, I have committed no crime. Then the king was very pleased and gave orders to Daniel to be taken out of the lion's den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. Daniel, throughout his life, was dependent upon God's Spirit. No matter how smart he was or how good he was, ultimately, at the end of the day, he just entrusted himself to God's Spirit. And here it is towards the end of his life, and God delivers him again in this miraculous way. And you read these really stupid Bible scholars who try to say stuff like, well, they want to demythologize the Bible. And so they want to say things like, well, maybe the lions weren't hungry. They'd been fed, or what, maybe he was able to hide in there or something. It's always contradicted by like the very next verse, because I love the next part. It's the meanest part, but there's something great about it. It says that the king then gave orders that they brought the men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them, their children, their wives in the lion's den, and they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. These lions were certainly hungry, and they were certainly mean, and these people didn't even hit the ground before they were destroyed by these lions. What Daniel said, as I was in there in the lion's den, it said an angel just shut the mouths of these lions. Now, I don't know where you're at in your life. I don't know what kind of circumstances you're facing. I don't know what season of life it is for you, but I do know this: if you remain faithful to God, you will not be disappointed. And the real invitation that God gives us is for a long, deliberate obedience to Him in our lives. We're in season, out of season, no matter what happens. If you put your trust in God, you will never be disappointed. And Daniel had learned that from when he was a little boy, and now we find him at the end of his life, in his last days, and he could look back and just say, man, I can see how God was faithful that whole time. Dude, I didn't know if those lions were gonna eat me or not. I just knew that God was gonna be faithful to me. And it says that great chapter in Hebrews 11, where it says that women receive back their children from the dead, and the Holy Spirit shut the mouths of lions, and these kinds of times where Christians got these victorious things. But then there's other times when Christians were not delivered, when they died, they were burned at the stake, when they suffered incredible loss, and yet God was glorified in all of it. And that's what we want to say as Christians. Man, I want to have an excellent spirit. I want to work hard. I want to pursue the Lord. I want to accomplish all the things that God has set before me. But most of all, I want to cling to Him and trust in His faithfulness. Would you stand to your feet?